In the beginning, people would say he's arrogant, but I don't think so.
Paul Simon is celebrated as one of the most meticulous songwriters in music history.
In the quiet of the railway station running scared.
Yet behind the gentle melodies and poetic lyrics, he carried sharp opinions about many of his peers. While the world adored rock's biggest names, Simon often found himself unimpressed, even dismissive of their work. He valued craft over chaos.
That's a G-sharp minor.
That's nice. It's a little Hawaiian, but it's nice.
Intimacy over spectacle, words over noise. And when bands crossed those lines, he didn't hesitate to critique them, sometimes brutally. Today, we dive into the bands that Paul Simon not only disliked, but, in some cases, outright hated. Some names might shock you, others might not. Number 1. The Rolling Stones. What happens when the elegance of poetry collides with the raw swagger of rock? For Paul Simon, the Rolling Stones were never more than a flashy spectacle draped in leather. He saw Mick Jagger strutting across the stage, but instead of admiring the performance, Simon often dismissed it as empty bravado. To him, the Stones represented an approach to music that was visceral, loud, and crowd-pleasing, but ultimately hollow when measured against the craftsmanship of storytelling. Simon once remarked in interviews that rock's obsession with rhythm and attitude often overshadowed lyrical meaning. It wasn't hard to imagine that his jab was aimed squarely at the Stones. The divide was not just about sound, it was cultural. The Stones were seen as the bad boys of British rock, reveling in excess and shock value, while Simon built his career on introspection, subtlety, and literary imagery. Fans who gravitated to I Can't Get No Satisfaction wanted rebellion. Fans of The Sound of Silence wanted reflection, and Simon believed reflection was what truly endured. In his eyes, rebellion without depth faded quickly. But here's the twist: the Stones did endure. Their raucous concerts and blues-driven swagger helped shape generations of rock fans. Yet Simon never relented. He insisted their longevity was about spectacle, not substance. To him, being a great band required more than energy. It required soul-searching lyrics that connected across time. This wasn't elitism. It was Simon's lifelong argument that music, at its core, should speak to the human condition, not just the hips on a Saturday night. The irony: both men, Simon with his acoustic guitar, Jagger with his snake-hipped confidence, were chasing the same cultural crown. One appealed to the mind, the other to the body. Fans could love both, but Simon simply couldn't forgive music that, in his opinion, neglected its duty to say something profound. Number 2. The Beatles. Imagine being one of the most acclaimed songwriters of your generation, yet constantly standing in the shadow of 4 Liverpudlians who rewrote pop music history. That was Paul Simon's lifelong struggle with the Beatles. He admired them, no doubt about that, but admiration often gave way to quiet resentment. For Simon, the Beatles represented both inspiration and competition, the band he could never quite outrun. And while fans adored them as cultural revolutionaries, Simon sometimes felt they blurred musical depth with commercial domination. Consider this: while Simon was carefully weaving lines like "Hello Darkness, my old friend," the Beatles were topping charts with "She Loves You" and "I Want to Hold Your Hand." To Simon, their genius was unquestionable, but he bristled at how their early pop simplicity still captured adoration, while his own more literary approach was relegated to niche acclaim. Even as the Beatles evolved into the experimental brilliance of Sgt. Pepper's and Abbey Road, Simon saw their fame as an unfair benchmark against which all other songwriters, including himself, were measured. There was also the problem of proximity. Simon and Garfunkel were riding high in the late 1960s, but no matter how many Grammys they won, the Beatles were always the bigger headline. Paul Simon once admitted that comparisons to Lennon and McCartney frustrated him deeply. It wasn't about jealousy in the conventional sense, it was about identity. He didn't want to be the American Lennon, or a folk response to McCartney. He wanted to stand apart, but the Beatles' shadow was too long. Ironically, Simon's critiques often circled back to his deepest insecurities. He occasionally dismissed some Beatles lyrics as shallow or overly whimsical, particularly McCartney's lighter pop offerings. He argued that true songwriting required piercing honesty and emotional gravitas. But in moments of candor, Simon acknowledged that Lennon's raw lyricism and McCartney's melodic genius haunted him. It was admiration mixed with rivalry, an uncomfortable cocktail he never quite swallowed. The real-world implication is clear. Artistic greatness often comes with unspoken rivalries. Simon's friction with the Beatles illustrates how even legends wrestle with the weight of comparison. In every industry, the giants overshadow the strivers, but those strivers, like Simon, sometimes craft work that outlasts the noise. Number 3. Led Zeppelin. When Paul Simon listened to Led Zeppelin, he didn't hear innovation, he heard excess. To him, their thunderous riffs and soaring wails sounded more like a carnival of volume than a canvas for lyrical art. While fans hailed Jimmy Page's guitar wizardry and Robert Plant's primal vocals as groundbreaking, Simon quietly dismissed Zeppelin's approach as bombastic showmanship. It wasn't that he failed to recognize their influence. It was that he believed they prioritized spectacle over substance, power over poetry. For a man obsessed with carefully chosen words, Zeppelin's mantra of bigger, louder, faster felt like betrayal of music's deeper purpose. The contrast could not have been sharper. Simon's artistry was defined by restraint, small details, precise phrasing, and melodies that carried emotional weight. Zeppelin, on the other hand, built songs like Sonic Mountains, with thunderous drums and distorted guitars that swallowed subtlety whole. Simon once hinted that heavy rock was little more than energy with no conversation. He may never have named Zeppelin directly, but the implication was clear. This was music that wowed the crowd, not the heart. Yet the irony is undeniable. Zeppelin's influence stretched across generations, redefining rock in ways Simon's folk-inspired catalog never attempted. They pioneered stadium-sized sound, blending blues, mythology, and raw sexuality into an unstoppable cultural force. Simon knew this, and that made his critiques sting sharper. For him, the question wasn't whether Zeppelin mattered, it was whether they mattered for the right reasons. To Simon, true songwriting meant capturing the vulnerability of human experience. Zeppelin's obsession with Norse gods, misty mountains, and psychedelic innuendo felt distant, almost comical, to his worldview. While Plant screamed about the hammer of the gods, Simon whispered about silence like a cancer grows. Which one carried more weight? For Simon, there was no contest. The deeper truth? Every generation divides along these same lines. Do we value technical spectacle or emotional resonance? Led Zeppelin epitomized one side. Simon stood firmly on the other. And his dismissal of Zeppelin wasn't just critique. It was defense of his own identity as a songwriter. Number 4. Pink Floyd. To Paul Simon, Pink Floyd embodied everything he disliked about rock's evolution: sprawling concepts, abstract lyrics, and sonic experimentation that, in his view, left human connection behind. While millions hailed The Dark Side of the Moon as a masterpiece, Simon was skeptical. He saw it less as songwriting and more as sound design, a clever arrangement of effects and atmospheres, but not the kind of lyrical craft he valued. For Simon, Pink Floyd's music was too detached, too cerebral, and too unwilling to speak plainly to the listener's heart. Consider Simon's songwriting philosophy: clarity, intimacy, and storytelling. He believed music should illuminate life's small truths: loneliness, love, regret, reconciliation. Pink Floyd, by contrast, painted in cosmic themes: time, madness, alienation on a planetary scale. Simon once remarked that rock bands sometimes hide behind production when words fall short. Fans of Floyd might argue that was the whole point, the grandeur, the scale. But to Simon, it felt like a dodge. Why talk about the universe when you could confront the pain in a single human relationship? The contrast was also generational. Simon came from folk clubs and Greenwich Village coffeehouses, where one guitar and a voice could hold a room. Pink Floyd rose from psychedelic light shows, drenched in reverb and surrounded by projections of flying pigs. To Simon, their world was theater. His was conversation. Still, one cannot ignore the impact Floyd had. The Wall became a cultural symbol of alienation, and Wish You Were Here turned absence into art. Yet Simon remained unmoved. He believed the deeper risk was that listeners could lose touch with real emotion in favor of sonic spectacle. In his worldview, you didn't need a 12-minute jam to capture despair. You needed a single line, written right. The irony: Simon himself experimented with world rhythms and layered production in albums like Graceland. But even then, his lyrics were front and center. He insisted that no matter how experimental the sound, the story had to be unmistakable. That was the line Floyd crossed, in his view. Music that dazzled ears but bypassed hearts. Number 5. The Doors. When Paul Simon listened to the Doors, he didn't hear poetry. He heard pretension. Jim Morrison may have been worshipped as the Lizard King, but to Simon, his brooding delivery and cryptic lyrics were more performance than substance. Where others saw a visionary poet channeling rebellion and darkness, Simon often saw theatrics wrapped in leather pants. He respected ambition, but Morrison's relentless push toward myth-making struck him as hollow. To Simon, great songs didn't need to be chanted from a mountaintop. They needed to whisper directly to the soul. Consider the difference. Simon's songs like Bridge Over Troubled Water spoke of comfort and connection, grounded in everyday struggles. Morrison, by contrast, barked lines like ride the snake, demanding listeners decode metaphors that felt more like provocation than revelation. For Simon, art lost its purpose when meaning became a puzzle. Music wasn't a riddle, it was an act of empathy. The Doors also embodied the excess of their era. Long improvisations, acid-fueled performances, and Morrison's unpredictable stage antics became central to their identity. But for Simon, this was distraction, not artistry. He believed a song's power should stand without theatrics. Strip away the lights and chaos, and what remains? In his eyes, not much. And yet, the Doors did change rock history. They fused blues, psychedelia, and menace into something unforgettable. But Simon simply couldn't buy into the mystique. To him, Morrison wasn't Rambo reborn. He was a man mistaking shock for substance. The difference mattered because Simon's lifelong mission was to prove that quiet honesty outlasts flamboyant rebellion. The larger lesson is timeless. In every field, there are voices who prize spectacle and others who prize substance. The Doors thrived on spectacle. Simon lived for substance. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but Simon believed only one carried lasting weight. Number 6. Bob Dylan. No rivalry in Paul Simon's career was more complicated than his relationship with Bob Dylan. On one hand, Simon revered Dylan's songwriting genius. On the other, he bristled at Dylan's mythic status and the electrified sound of his band era. When Dylan picked up an electric guitar in 1965 and transformed folk into rock rebellion, Simon felt betrayed. Folk music was meant to be intimate, personal, a conversation between artist and listener. Dylan's thunderous band-backed anthems, like a Rolling Stone or Maggie's Farm, seemed to bulldoze that intimacy. For Simon, lyrics should be clear and piercing. Dylan's band-driven songs were drenched in noise, at times burying the subtleties beneath walls of sound. Simon saw this as a dilution of Dylan's own gift. Why trade the sharp intimacy of blowin' in the wind for the chaotic frenzy of electric guitars? In Simon's worldview, the move wasn't progress, it was compromise. But there was also something more personal at play. Dylan had become the voice of a generation, the poet-prophet of the 1960s. Simon, equally ambitious, often felt eclipsed. His own achievements with Garfunkel, multiple Grammys, chart-topping records, were constantly compared to Dylan's revolutionary status. In interviews, Simon admitted that those comparisons stung. Admiration and resentment coexisted in every note. Still, Simon never denied Dylan's genius. He simply questioned the execution of Dylan's band era, which, to him, drowned poetry in volume. He argued that when art becomes spectacle, it risks losing its sharpest edge. And perhaps he was right. Many fans at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965 booed Dylan for going electric. Simon stood quietly with those who believed folk's strength lay in simplicity. Yet Dylan's band era undeniably reshaped music. It opened the door for a fusion of folk and rock, spawning genres that shaped the next half-century. Even Simon, begrudgingly, had to acknowledge the influence. But he clung to his principle: intimacy beats amplification. The broader insight: greatness always carries dissent. Dylan's evolution enraged purists. just as Simon's critiques highlighted. But descent is part of progress. Simon's discomfort wasn't just about Dylan. It was about watching a movement he cherished transform into something unrecognizable. Paul Simon's critiques remind us that even legends measure greatness differently. His disdain wasn't just bitterness. It was a defense of artistry rooted in honesty and craft. Whether you agree or not, his rivalries show us this. Music's power lies not in volume or fame, but in meaning that endures.